Welcome everybody to Zero Shot, the AI podcast without the hype. I'm Lou Jury, the Managing Director of Advancer, and as always, I'm joined by James Gorsey, the CEO of Cadence. G'day, James.
G'day, Lou. G'day, everyone. Welcome to all our listeners around the world, and welcome to our special guest as well. I won't spoil the surprise, though.
It's awesome, isn't it? Today is episode 12, James, and for the very first time, we've got a guest in the room, haven't we? We're going to talk about some awesome topics and conversations around AI adoption inside large organizations and why many of them may not actually be really in the race, and also what universities are and are not doing about it. And also you're going to wrap it up with talent today. This is a really unvarnished version, isn't it? This episode.
Yeah, it's going to be great, and looking forward to introducing our guest after this message from our sponsor, Prompt Cowboy. Prompt Cowboy is our sponsor for this episode. So if you're building agents, running workflows, or just trying to get consistent output from your AI tools, it's pretty difficult. Their agentic prompting feature does all the heavy lifting. So head over to promptcowboy.ai and get your business running smoother than ever, Lou.
Awesome. Look, yeah, thanks to Prompt Cowboy, Matt and Henry, always supporting us as usual. So let's get into our guest intro. And today is a really warm welcome to a good friend of ours that we've both been friends with for a long time, and showing a bit of vintage now, isn't it? But it's Brett Wiskar. And Brett is both a friend of ours. This conversation's who knows where it's going to go, James?
It could go anywhere. Welcome, Brett. How's it going?
Yeah, really good. Thanks to both of you for inviting me on. Yeah, I've known both of you for a really long time in the digital space, dating back various generations of technology, and worked with you both in different capacities and watched our different sort of areas of expertise grow, and insights into this kind of space is fascinating. And I've been an avid listener of Zero Shot from day one. So I'm delighted to be guest number one, or guinea pig guest, or whatever we're going to call it. But
we won't
Zero Shot guest on the Zero Shot pod.
Yeah, the zeroth. So welcome, and maybe I'll do a little bit of introduction to Brett. But Brett is an innovation and strategy advisor with more than 25 years of experience helping organizations navigate technological change without the hype. By day, he's
Very
a national
appropriate.
manager. Very appropriate. By day, he's the national manager of digital innovation and change at Australian Catholic University, which means he's not just advising on AI and education, he's living from the inside. But Brett's focus isn't just on the tools, it's what happens after the tools and the second and third order effects on culture and capability and the people in your organization, or the people that you're about to hire into your organization. So today, hopefully, we're going to get into AI adoption, why a lot of organizations aren't really in the race yet, and what AI is doing in the education sector and around it, and the future of talent, straight from somebody who's, I think, got a front row seat to that game. Brett, is that fair to say?
Yeah, and look, I think that because of what I do in my day job, but also sort of advising roles that I have, and speaking and consulting and all sorts of things. One of the things I love about sort of doing digital and innovation and those kind of things is the exposure that you get to all these different businesses. You get to learn different industries and sectors and approaches and those kinds of things. And what you learn in one, you get to take on to the other. And so AI is sort of this massive, rapidly moving piece of disruption and innovation and opportunity. And it's interesting to kind of watch the lessons of previous iterations on innovation and how they're playing out again, and having a high level view of that, where I really spend a lot of time talking to people about strategy and high level perspectives on how they do technology driven innovation, not necessarily in the selection of tools or the integration level events, but kind of what do they mean for the organization. And so, yeah, really fascinating to hear the pod up to this point, and delighted to be here and kind of give some perspective on some of those things. And as Lou said, God knows where this might go. Tend to be old enough and grumpy enough to be a bit direct on things. So we'll see where we go.
Well, that's good. Well, that's a good segue, Brett, into where we're heading for our couple of segments that we're going to chat about today. So, look, you and I, we met many years ago, and we were in the website days, right? We're building websites in the late 90s and early 2000s, and I think I look back and it was about databases, and then the mobile wave, and then the cloud wave, and now it's AI. An opening question for you: why do you think AI is different? What makes this particular moment in time and this particular technological innovation all that different?
I think Lou, like when we look at what technology does to business, or what innovation and disruption do to businesses, and a lot of business leaders think that innovation is technology. They're invariably linked, but they're not necessarily the same thing. But when we look at where we've seen technology waves come through, they tend to have a period. We look at things like Gartner's hype cycle tells us the speed with which a piece of technology is coming. But a lot of businesses or a lot of business leaders look at, or sectors look at it and kind of go, what do the tools do for me and how can I adopt them? The difference as we progress, in the last 50 years, and if you look at innovation even further back, what we find is that waves of technology come at us, but the duration from start to commercial viability to complete takeover of a particular area, that duration is getting shorter. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. So Lou, back in the day when you and I were trying to convince people that the internet was a place for doing, not a place for viewing, we got into this thing where we found areas in industries and in the economy where we couldn't bring digital innovation because there was no digital. They didn't have platforms, they didn't have connectivity, they didn't have mobile devices, they didn't have all these things. So this technology is really flexible because if you know how to apply a tool, you can get the tool to do incredible things. And it's actually a problem-solving piece of technology. But in addition to that, everybody everywhere is ubiquitously connected. Everybody's got high bandwidth data and high definition screens and local processing and redundant cloud access. And so we can find a business that would have traditionally been a blue collar business with everybody, with, grime under their fingernails and, working in tough environments. 25 years ago, we would have gone to them and said, have you thought about digital innovation? And they kind of go, look, we're not equipped to do that. Now you can say to anybody, what are you doing with AI? And they can be like, oh, well, everybody on my business is connected all the time. 24/7, I can talk to anybody at any time. I can get data from the field. I get data from my staff. I can get data from my supply chain and my clients, and all those sorts of things. So the environment, the commercial environment is it's warmed, ready to go. And what that means is this technology is really agile and it can move really quickly, but every business has the foundation ready to apply it, which means organizations that 3 weeks ago didn't consider themselves to be doing anything in AI, they could have a very different view today because they had a great meeting last Wednesday and decided they were going to, get their shoes on and get into it.
Yeah, maybe that's a good segue. Like we've got the meeting room, we've got the people sitting around the table, and they've got a lot of goodwill, and we know this AI thing is really exciting, and we want to take advantage of it and hone our competitive advantage. But not everybody has the ability to strategize around the capabilities of AI, Brett. And the question is, what do you actually tell them to do on Monday morning? What is that first step into this brave new world that a group of people who really want to make a difference but don't know where to start? Where does it start?
I think James, you need to have some familiarity with the tools. I find it difficult to believe that anybody in the Western world who, is still gainfully employed in the economy hasn't had some exposure to chat or isn't getting AI results at the top of the Google search, whether they know their AI results or not. The fact that it's natural language processing, we all speak a language and it speaks all of the languages. So it's accessible to everybody, whether we know it or not. I think the difference really is there's a lot of people out there, and I think those of us on this call and a lot of people we work with, because we're deep into it, we assume the level of knowledge is greater than it is. But you will be surprised if you go to another organization and have a conversation with them. There is a massive section of the population that treat ChatGPT like they've treated Google for the last decade, in that they treat it as a question answering machine. And that is not, that is not what it's for. And that Maslow's hammer, when all of you, when the hammer's the only tool you've got, all of your problems look like nails. That's kind of what they're doing. They're saying Google worked like this and my brain has a pattern for that. And as a result, this other tool that turns up in a browser also has this field I can type in. And so I will treat it like that. And so I think when we're talking to people who aren't on their AI journey, we need to reconcile that we might be talking to somebody who genuinely doesn't understand its capacity and its power. So, how do I structure a prompt, and how can I stream of consciousness dump everything I know about this topic into a prompt and let the language model consume it? Can I take a stream of consciousness document that I put in a text file, paste it in a prompt Cowboy, get a formatted prompt, feed it into the LLM of my choice, and all of a sudden I'm not, finding out how tall a celebrity is. but I'm actually getting it to feedback 4 different ways that I could restructure how my business undertakes this task. And that becomes a real cognitive leap. So we can't take people who are paddling around in the shallow end of the pool and put them on the 10-meter diving board. We have to move them to a slightly deeper area of the pool. And so helping people understand that it can do, because invariably with software, and this goes back in my whole career in technology, the people who get the most out of software aren't the ones who know how to do it. They're the ones who know it can be done and are prepared to give it a crack and fail. And so if we can get organizations or individuals or leaders or IT people or HR people or professional development people to go, there's probably massive upside to this that we're getting to, and we need to start. And that's all we need to do is start. The tools are moving really quickly. We're seeing a lot of sort of Claude penetration and co-work coming from different platforms and flow-based agents and all sorts of other things that are incredibly powerful. And you can get to the point in a month where you can start doing some of that stuff if you're prepared to do something today where you start treating it more than a sophisticated Google search. So, we got to get in the game. And there's lots of businesses that aren't in the game. They've got 300 staff. Their IT managers come to them and said, I got a free trial of 15 Copilot licenses because our Azure spend is of this height. What do we do? And the CEO says, well, give it to my PA because they manage my inbox, and give it to some of your IT staff. And they do. And they now think that they are at the AI table. And, they then discover that Copilot can't play nicely with shared mailboxes, and all of a sudden their PA can't get it to do something they thought it would do. And they roll their eyes and go, this isn't as valuable. We'll go back to the same iterative approach to improving our business that we've been using for 15 or 20 or 80 years. We need to understand that it has the potential to dramatically change things. And if it's not changing things for us, it's because we didn't ask it the right question, not because it couldn't. And the businesses that keep asking and understand what it can do will dramatically disrupt the ones who aren't.
I think I agree with you there, but I think things have moved on since the year of the Dabble. On this podcast, Brett, you would have been aware 2024, 25, we sort of coined the year of the Dabble. And I think the innovators are stretching out their legs right now. The ones that are actually, the early adopters are getting ahead. They've moved on from Copilot. And I've been seeing it personally that they're actually, ditching the Copilot piece, going to Claude, hooking up the MCP that now works, in the last week with Microsoft. And they're actually going, what, we don't need to be alongside Microsoft at this time. We might come back around and join the party. But, it's interesting that organizations do call that, what you just described, their AI strategy. And it's interesting to sort of hear what is actually happening. But I actually think there's a massive disparate, that Gartner hype cycle is actually really, really wide, because there's the brave companies up the one end as the early adopters, and then the other ones are playing the ostrich. They've got their head in the sand, right? What are you seeing in the larger organizations? Is there the same there? Are the ones that sort of just doing the Copilot, doing a bit of innovation theater, and going, yep, we're doing AI, versus the ones that are actually the rubber's hitting the road? They're building agentic AI, they're fully MCP, they've got their own LLMs, they've got their own, they're building their own, deep integrations and things like that.
I think it is a diverse spectrum. And it's definitely not a bell curve, in that what you'll find is there is sort of an early adoption. There's a group of early some innovators and some early adopters. And we don't get the other half of the bell curve. What we get is just everybody else in every industry. Yeah. You guys are aware I do a lot of speaking at conferences and corporate clients and that kind of stuff. And a lot of corporates, because of the legacy, the Microsoft alignment, the Azure, the hosting, the enterprise platform kind of stuff, they very much feel that they are probably, at least in the user group in their organization, they feel quite constrained within Microsoft. What I have seen with that is Microsoft have started to shift their narrative, where I think the Microsoft themselves are starting to say, AI is out there and we can give you a window to it. And I think the Windows correlation is really sort of potentially coming back as a way where they're kind of going, Copilot can be your user interface for AI, and whose AI it is and how you use it is not really overly our concern. And I think that's valuable for them too, as it preserves their market reach, because you don't have to divorce them to go somewhere else. You can go, do you know what? I've been with Microsoft as a CIO or a CEO since forever, and I can stay there and I can continue to do these other things. So whether it's Copilot or whether it's Copilot as a doorway to something else doesn't really matter. I think what we do see is there are some organizations who are looking at that and saying, well, if I can do it safely, then I'll do it. And there's a real issue there around experimentation culture in their organizations and their appetite for failure. I frequently tell a story where I went to work with an organization and I looked at their organizational charter, and it had a risk page in the document, and it said, I think there were 8 categories, and one of them, which was innovation, it said it had a high appetite for risk, and all of the others it had zero appetite for risk. And I'm like, I can't help you as an innovator if you have 100% appetite for innovation and 0% appetite for reputational risk or financial risk or data risk. We can't do anything. And so organizations have to figure out what risk looks like and what experimentation they're prepared to tolerate. And corporates are traditionally awful at that because you get given a job, you get given a chair, you get given a PD, you get given a set of outcomes, and saying, I know how to do that, but I think I'll mess around over here and see if I can run the risk of doing things badly. But the possible upside is I do things wildly better isn't how we've employed people in capitalism ever. And so we need organizations and leaders and executive groups who kind of go, hang on, we need to set some boundaries where we can run experiments, we know we're going to fail, we can fail safely, we can do those kinds of things. So corporates need to get on that journey, and I don't think they're there yet. We are seeing organizations that are giving out, whether it's an enterprise relationship with OpenAI or a Copilot or a Claude or any number of other things. We're starting to see that. But again, I think what we have to do as individuals, and this translates to how a business or a team might work, almost coming up with your AI architecture. And so, I did an exercise with somebody, actually I did an exercise last week with someone who had left a very technical role in a very technical company and had gone to a slightly less technical company where he was the technical leader. And he came in and looked at how the business functioned. And he went, we do this and we do this and we do this, and our intellectual property is here, here, and here. And we do all this other work that isn't specializing on our intellectual property, and we just do it because it's the only way to get to the end game. And he's like, I can innovate that. And so instead of using the AI as a conversational thing, it becomes how do I architect it? How do I architect an AI experience that will improve my life, improve the life of the team, improve the life of the client, improve efficiency, starting to ask those business value conversations. And I think that that's where the real opportunity is here. It's not, if we go into it as a technology conversation, we end up with technology outcomes. If we go into it as a business operations conversation, we start to generate business outcomes, and that has an impact on the P&L. We can also use it to get rid of tech debt, and tech debt doesn't hit your P&L, it hits your balance sheet. And so, we need to kind of consider, how do we reinvent our businesses with this new magical set of tools that didn't exist before? And it's organizations that are prepared to have those kind of conversations. You got a CEO of a 300-person company and he's given Copilot to, the IT team and a couple of executive assistants and the marketing manager so they can generate Facebook content, and that's their strategy. Down the road's a 300-person organization, and the CEO, she's dragged in the IT manager, and they're having conversations about how they can automate processes, how they can drive outcomes, how they can build internal mechanisms to onboard new staff quicker, to maintain skills. And those are the sorts of things that we can build really easily. And I think until you're doing that in your own role, or you're given license to do it in your organization, then you're going to struggle. I do a thing.
Brett, is the IT manager or the CIO or the CTO the right person here to actually take the reins of an AI strategy?
That is a phenomenally good question, in that I think because the toolkit to AI comes from tech companies, that's who the business goes to, because they haven't negotiated a technology contract or a technology purchase ever before without that person in the room. And so they've become the owner of it. But interestingly, the electricity that comes out of the walls powers all the computers, but we don't give the electricity contract to the CIO to negotiate. We give it to the CFO and the ops person to determine how much we need. And that's where the value gets created.
And I think it's about the value. And I actually think from what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing, there's actually really aware CIOs and CTOs giving the CRO, the chief revenue officer, or the head of sales, if you like, someone who's on the C-suite, who looks after revenue for the organization, not just cost efficiency and productivity uplift, but revenue, gives them the keys to the AI strategy and says, you make it happen because this is actually going to move the needle. And if it doesn't move the needle and it doesn't produce revenue, there's no point doing it. And this is back to this whole hype cycle thing, isn't it?
And look, the signal in the noise here feels like it's a revisiting of what risk in business is. Like, we're being forced into this conversation now as business leaders, where technology technology has to wash its own face now. It used to just be considered a cost center and like a grudge purchase. And all right, let's drive down the cost as much as we can, get the most efficiency that we possibly can. But now increasingly those more technical stakeholders are being asked to make more business informed calls. And it's not the kind of game that they're used to playing. Like the signal for me sounds like a bit of a capability gap more so than a like individuals being a problem kind of gap. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very much so. And I think back at sort of, CIOs or CEOs for that matter that I've worked with. But if you take a great CIO or a great IT manager in a small company that doesn't have a CIO, the really good ones don't think about themselves as technology people. They think about themselves as operations people. They want to understand the business. What are the problems the clients have? What are the problems the staff have? Where does the business model strong? Where's it weak? Where's it innovative? Where's it slow? And then they seek to find technology solutions to do that. If you've got that CIO or that IT manager in your business at this point in time, listen to them when they start to talk to you about AI. If your CIO is helping you make sure that your Citrix instance is patched, and that's the value proposition of the budget last year, looks like the budget year before, that's not the person to talk to in your business about AI, because they're not the person who's going to reinvent your business for you. And that's what this technology will do. It will reinvent your business for you. So the person holding the keys to the AI in your business has to be the person that you believe has the depth of knowledge and subject matter expertise to reinvent the business with you.
Like we've kind of started talking about this person as a single person, but it rarely happens in isolation, and something that's been perpetually discussed with respect to a digital transformation or technology adoption within organizations, especially in higher risk circumstances like blockchain or AI or what have you. If you don't have that culture of experimentation, you can't really hope to adopt AI in the highest value ways. As somebody who's kind of worked with organizations through that transition over a number of years now, Brett, what does that culture actually look like in practice? Can it be built quickly or like shoehorned in, or does it always have to take years, or does it have to take one visionary hero to kind of shoulder the burden of the whole company? You know what I'm saying?
I think probably now more than ever before, it's not too late. Like I think you can really reinvent teams or departments or functions or value propositions really, really quickly at this point in time. I remember, maybe 10 years ago, I was having coffee with the CEO of a large financial institution in this country. And he was talking about how, and he chose his words really carefully. He was talking about innovation. And he was saying whenever they tried to innovate internally, what they discovered was the antibodies of the organization saw the innovation as foreign and attacked it, killed it. And he really used that sort of medical language. And I said, well, what are you doing about it? He said, when we have an idea, we take it out of the business. We send it down the road into a serviced office with 3 people, and we give them 6 months and this much money. And when their idea is a toddler, we check in on it and ask what else it needs and how much value it can create when it's a teenager. And when it's got hair on its chest and a deeper voice, we bring it back into the business. Because if anybody tries to kill it, it punches them in the mouth and says, this is my value proposition, and it moves forwards. And I think that idea, that understanding that the way we currently function in our business is trying to stop us from functioning differently. That's how businesses are designed, and it's how human brains work. If we're aware of that, then we can kind of defend a better future. And when I was doing consulting a long time ago, what I would see is businesses would see a market opportunity. They'd produce a piece of intellectual property or an innovation that addressed the market opportunity, and revenue would arrive. And overnight, the business would switch from being innovative to being about defending existing revenue. And they would hang on to their existing revenue for as long as they could before the market got disrupted and somebody stole a business out from underneath them and their company would collapse. And so we have to be these organizations that kind of wake up every day and go, am I inventing the best version of my company for next year? Or am I prolonging the version I had 3 years ago? And if it's the latter, then something has to change, because if you don't change, the market will change around you, and that'll be the end of it. And so I think you kind of have to look at your business and go, am I experimenting? Am I constantly designing the version of my company for 2 years from now? And that goes down to, am I redesigning my department? Am I redesigning my team? Am I redesigning my individual skills? Am I redesigning how I train my staff? Am I redesigning the business model, the collaboration opportunities with our clients or our partners? Asking those questions is, how are we designing what the business will look like in 2 years' time? I don't know what AI is going to do in 2 years' time, but I know it's going to make things different. So if we can make it an organization or ourselves something that tolerates change, then we'll be well positioned.
That's super fascinating. So, Brett, we're going to move into the next segment, and that one is all about universities, and a lot of people are very interested in what you do in that space. And I suppose quickly talk us through your story within what's happening at universities, what you're seeing, what they're getting right, what necessarily they might need some assistance with, about that adaptation that you talk about, and from where you sit inside one, what is actually blocking the moving forward of AI? Is it the leadership? Is it funding? Is it regulation? Or is there something else?
Without sort of getting into the nitty gritty specifics within any particular institution, I travel around a bit and sort of visit different universities. I've done some lecturing at some universities in Sydney, going back sort of 15 years, had some conversations with some big Queensland-based universities about how they were, teaching technology. And I think university sector, like any sector, I think the regulatory environment is struggling to maintain pace and understand what it's got to do with this piece of technology. That's probably primary issue number one. I think in all universities there are, cultural aspects around, what technology can do for staff or students. And then there's really a piece, and probably the bit that's fascinating for me is, the way in which universities will use AI in their staff is probably very similar to how other large organisations, a Department of Transport or a government agency or, a department within a bank or an insurance company might work. So that's not really particularly controversial. I think we're all seeking to drive innovation and see how we can get better outcomes and faster turnarounds and more insights from our data and create sort of greater value opportunities. I think the area that the sector is struggling to determine what to do with is how does it utilize AI with students, or how do students utilize AI? And the big issue there is how does the industry redesign itself to produce graduates that will work in an AI workforce? And so, there's every time you turn around, there's a piece of data that says AI is going to take all the entry level jobs. And then what you do is you realize that entry level jobs in certain sectors are going through the roof. And we've seen that for years and years because all of a sudden the cost to do something gets cheaper. And there were areas we wanted to use that skill to do that thing that we could never make a business case around. And so, there were 100,000 instances in this country every year where you wanted something done and that required 1,000 grads. And you could only justify it because it was only 100,000. But when the cost of doing that thing gets cut by 78%, it ceases to be 100,000 times we want that thing done. It becomes 15 million. And all of a sudden we need all these entry-level people. And the toolkit that you're using to do it with is going to be different. So, I think that this idea that, career paths are going to be very different. But the idea that, 3 years from now, no 24-year-old will have a job out of university is just mental. Like, people who say that stuff really make these kind of existential statements like they're fact, and they point to particular data points. This enterprise software company in the States just got rid of 1,200 people, ergo the sky is falling. And you're like, you have no idea about what happened at the boardroom and the nature of their institutional investors and the pressure that was being placed on them to headcount and all sorts of other bits and pieces. So we know that we don't have, there's a difference between data and an anecdote. And anybody who's posting on LinkedIn or in a broadsheet publication that employment as we know it is dying is because they are gravitating towards a story that they want to tell, or simply because they just like stories. So it's not really the real thing. The question for me is, how do we educate people that are going to have incredible careers in the future that we're creating and that they're going to create with us? And for me, that goes back to kind of that adaptability thing. I didn't work a day in my life in the area that I went to university for. And, I suspect that, statistically, probably one of you two guys could say something very similar. But what I've made a career of is looking at what tools are available and how they create value in, 3 countries, in 15 different industries, in 10 different companies. And it's worked out really well for me. And probably the value proposition that I've always brought is, how do you bring a fresh set of eyes to figure out how to do something differently? And hence the gravitation towards innovation. What I think we're going to get from a next generation, and all of us on this call are fathers of children ranging from sort of, early 20s to about to go to school. We're talking about that generation of people, but what are the skills that we want to give them? And so I think the onus is on the education sector globally to redesign what education looks like, in that, the idea that you would go and do a 3-year undergraduate course at a university in Australia to learn how to write code to work in IT is insane. Send someone to TAFE for 12 weeks, give them a subscription to Coursera or something, put them on the Azure or the AWS certification path, and build this person's skills that align to the real world that they're going to work in. And I don't think IT is the only instance of that. I think that medicine, I think that architecture, I think that engineering, I think that, journalism and communication and all these different things have to kind of go, what is the value we want these graduates to create? And are they best served by the courses we've designed and the journey we're going to go on? And
I want to pick up on something you said there, Brett, because I've literally today had one of our placement students, because I teach at the local university here in the computer science degree, and literally today it's his first project in the real world, so to speak. And I sat him down and I walked him through just a little kind of plan, implement, check kind of Claude code workflow for the first time. And this guy's almost about to, he's graduating his CS degree imminently. It all fell into place for him. He saw the way that somebody with experience uses an AI system and had to rewire himself out of that I'm doing the doing to the I'm making the decisions for the system to act upon with my intent. And it's now dependent on my ability to kind of articulate what that intent is in specific enough ways for the system to do its best work, but also non-specific enough ways for it to be creative and see through the gaps that I might have in my understanding as well. And I guess this is a completely different skill set to the one that we have been told for decades and maybe hundreds of years at this point is important in knowledge work. It's literally called knowledge work, and we're talking about the fact that we need less knowledge now to do it, more decision-making capability. What's the structural thing that needs to change, in your view, in the way that we teach people? And this is beyond even just universities, but because we've got essentially a broken instrument for determining whether or not somebody has the right capabilities now. And now it's about how do we recraft that instrument? I'm wondering what your thoughts are around crafting what that instrument is and how we should be determining whether or not somebody has the right capabilities for a role they're entering into. What structurally has to change?
So, James, when I go and work with organizations and present at their internal conferences and those kind of things, it's really interesting in that the reason we even do that is we want our people to do different. We want our people to think different. We want to evolve them. If they were already operating at the optimum, we wouldn't spend the time and the energy doing that. And you made reference in your question there to the term knowledge worker. And I think that we, on a cultural level, we use that label poorly. We think that everybody who works in air conditioning at a screen is a knowledge worker. And I have worked with thousands of people who meet that criteria who are not knowledge workers. They are conduits. We talk about businesses. You can't find a business on the Western Hemisphere that doesn't have some sort of business process that's controlled and administered through Microsoft Excel. I ask that question from the stage at conferences all the time. Put up your hand if you've got something operating in your business or in your team or in your to-do list where you're running something in Microsoft Excel. The room is never empty of hands going up when you ask that question. And what we're doing is we're saying this person who processes this thing, they take inputs from this meeting or this conduit or this ticket raising system or this finance system or these leads or these sales opportunities, whatever it is, they take it and they do something to it, and then we do something over here. And that's done in Excel, and then we think we're clever because we do it in a Kanban board. We're not applying knowledge. What we're doing is we're hiring people to do process. If your job and your skill level and your level of cognitive application at your job is process driven, then you're not a knowledge worker. You are somebody who is doing something that a system can be designed to do. Now, it used to be a decision gate and robotic process automation, and it had to be very algorithm based. It was a decision tree and it was difficult to implement. The bar for implementation on that stuff has fallen away dramatically. And so what we need people to do is people to focus on the edge cases where there is higher value opportunity, or to redesign the process. I frequently talk about disintermediation, in that we have these supply chains that are, full of intermediaries. We've got a wholesaler and a warehousing company and a trucking company, and every industry has their version of that. But what we find is from one end to the other, there's 9 steps, but 5 of those steps are just intermediate. They think their value is because they hold a position in the chain. They're not adding value. And so when we see those industries get disrupted, that's disintermediation. We need to be the disintermediaries in our own business, walking around looking for things that aren't adding value and finding ways to eliminate them. And that might be in how I spend my time. It might be in how I redesign my job. It might be in how I train or recruit or add value or automate process or that kind of stuff. And I think a really good place to start is Microsoft Excel doing something in your business? Because if it is, there's a much better way. And you can fix that by Friday if you really put your mind to it. But we all also have this thing where we do that in Excel. It's not broken. Well, the time is coming where it actually is broken, because somebody who doesn't have it being done in Excel can turn it around faster and better and more personalized and in a way that creates greater value. And so what we want people to do, whether they're being trained at university or whether they're being onboarded and put through an induction, what we want people to do is find ways to create value. I don't want to hire someone and give them a PD and a chair and a laptop and say, do the job that I designed for you, because I can't design all the jobs and I don't have the domain expertise for all of the chairs. What I want to do is put you in front of a chair with a laptop and go, here's where the business needs to get to. Can you help me get there? And those are the graduates that we have to spit out. Not just universities. High schools have to put them out. Universities have to put them out. Internships have to put them out. How we take people when we promote them from a level 6 in our corporate structure to a level 5, that process has to go through that same mechanism. We don't want someone who is going to babysit the chair that was there when they got there.
Brett, you talk about as well, from a university sort of sector, they're a big beast, right? You've been working in the university sector. They're like cities and countries and states within their own sort of ways. I mean, a lot of them, are federally funded, and they're quite huge. They're also risk averse, inconsistent, and also slow moving organizations, right? And we're putting our trust and faith in what they call pedagogy, which is, for listeners, the way that you teach. It's the structural element of putting together a teaching and learning program. AI in 2 years has overtaken a huge amount of things. We're talking about plagiarisms and copy checkers and putting M dashes in your assignments and all that. A lot of unis have actually thrown their hands in the air and gone, you know what? Use AI, but do it in a really meaningful way. Don't just plagiarize, because we'll know when you do that. But we're actually going to do a lot more assignments now that are group work. It's because of the humanistic piece behind it, because we need this thing called social interaction, to be able to get on as humans, right? If I'm a CEO hiring right now and I've got 2 people there, 2 candidates, if you like, in 2026. What am I looking at, from those candidates that's going to basically allow me to, choose the one that's actually going to fit into my organization? And what are the unis actually producing? Because aren't we just going to hire for the person that actually can build relationships and talk and communicate and things like that? Because of all, everything's been sort of, it's become a level playing field in terms of, those good communicators can now code. Where is a CEO or an employer looking right now, and what are unis doing for that?
Look,
being slow-moving organisations.
Look, I think the university sector is actually investing really heavily at changing that, and I think probably COVID and even kind of earlier technology waves really got them to sharpen that toolkit. There are some phenomenal educational tools happening in the sector. Sydney Uni's come out with some really astonishing stuff that is genuinely changing the sector. And that's a podcast in and of itself. So I think there is a lot of movement. I think that a really valuable part of that question, Lou, if I can kind of pull on that thread, is if you're the CEO or of a small business or you're the chief people officer of a sizable business, what are you looking for? I think that you need to understand that whatever you're hiring for today will not be aligned to what you will want to hire for in 2 or 3 years' time. And so if you've got a capacity in your recruitment process to look for adaptability, growth mindset, inherent problem solving ability, intrinsic motivation, if you can find someone who is like that and they got themselves a 4.5 GPA, hire that person. Because the 6.2 GPA person that comes in and doesn't have those things, they aren't your person. And I was working with a large multinational engineering firm 8 or 10 months ago, and we were looking at the value proposition creation. And if you were, a technical skill provider, a software developer, an architect, an engineer, actuary, something like that, in the past 50 years, your value proposition to your industry was your technical skill. And if you were incredible at it, people would find you and find a way to pay you well for the skill that you or your organization delivered. When AI means everybody's great at maths, when AI is integrated into the engineering applications and Autodesk and people like that are flattening the playing field so that there are very few outliers at the pointy end of what is physically possible, the value proposition then becomes, who is the person I'm dealing with from that architecture firm, that engineering firm, that accounting firm? And is that person able to get inside my head and inside my business and the value proposition of the business that I run to help me identify which problems they can solve really well with these technical toolkits? And so again, if I was going to hire an engineer tomorrow, I'd be hiring an engineer who was a decent engineer, who was capable and competent and understood the toolkit and was curious about my business and curious about my client's business and passionate about finding solutions to problems and wanted to look at 4 different ways to solve each problem and choose the one that had the greatest longevity or the greatest return on investment or the greatest data integrity or whatever it was. And so it's those kind of skills that I think are actually incredibly valuable. LinkedIn do a thing every year called the Skills on the Rise report. And as part of that, it tends to be a lot of things. They partner with World Economic Forum and they look at all the data and who's recruiting what. It tends to be a lot of kind of relationship management and what we call softer skills. Interestingly, the softer skills are actually the hard ones because you can't teach them very well. You can't measure them very well. So they're hard for organizations to get their head around. But soft skills are really important, and LinkedIn and World Economic Forum will identify that. But what we kind of see is that in that report, they tell us that 10% of skills that exist today were not required in jobs 20 years ago. But because we've been in business for the last 20 years, we've seen that happen so slowly that we didn't actually notice the change take place. And so I'll get that statistic wrong and we can put in the show notes the link to the Skills on the Rise report. But what we're trying to find is that the world, the economy, the skills, the tasks, the jobs reinvent themselves all the time. We just don't happen to see it because it doesn't happen in real time in front of our face. So if it's changing so much all the time, being really good at just adopting the new thing and adapting to it and figuring out how to utilize it, that's really important. And so I don't necessarily want someone who got high distinctions. I want someone who got a good solid mark and can't wait to be sent to a client to spend the first week as an engineer acting as a business analyst on a problem that in a sector they didn't know about before. You know,
it links back to something that you
valuable.
said earlier. So it links back to something you said earlier, Brett, about hiring. Well, people need to be now thinking about re-architecting the job that they're already doing and redesigning the job that ultimately, in this circumstance, you're going to give them, not to do that job in the first place and kind of be, dare I say, a little bit more utilitarian about, hey, how can we get a high quality outcome here and how can we do it better and faster and cheaper and so on. That's great. And I love that. But how do we actually find these people? How do we look for them? How do we hire them? How do we go? Like you mentioned a couple of attributes that we might look for in the hiring process, but have you been able to, like, just maybe from a personal perspective, what's your journey been like in that? And how do you find people like that?
Look, I think there's a real sort of challenge there in that sometimes people interview well because they have great soft skills, but they don't necessarily perform well. And we've all hired people that seem to interview incredibly well. And then sort of, 6 days or 6 months in, we kind of recognize that maybe this person didn't do what they said on the tin. So there's humans are unpredictable things. And as a result, it's not a precise science. But I think that we need to consider ahead of an interview how we might want those things to show up in our business. And how do I design an interview process where I might be able to identify those things? So rather than asking people, what's an example of a project you've done before or a team that you've worked in before, but what do you want to know about that project? Do you want to know, what was the challenge and how did you solve it? Or do you want to know what was the challenge and how did the people involved in that challenge draw together to solve the problem? Because the latter is actually a much more interesting question. Can I work with you? Are we able to work together? Is much more valuable than have you ever solved a problem? Because a lot of the problem solving an individual achieves is a product of the environment they're in. So if they tell you how they solved a problem somewhere else and you take them out of that environment and put them into your organization, you're not going to get the same outcomes. So asking questions about how will you solve problems in our environment, and that might be designing a task and sharing it with them the week in advance and getting them to talk you through how they'd approach that task. Getting them to talk through 3 different ways they might solve that approach. Getting you to go, here's an AI toolkit and here's a bunch of data. What can you tell me? it depends on the organization, but I think the idea that we would kind of produce a job description and we would come up with some sort of, series of identical questions that we ask 6 candidates to, and we rank them on a 1 to 5, and we come up with an algorithm at the end that tells us we should hire the guy in the blue shirt, and our second best candidate is that, that lady who, worked in a bank in Uzbekistan. we have to be much more interested in how these people think, not what are the skills, because the skills they've used to get to this point in their career are not the skills they're going to use in the next 5 years in our business.
Well, that's a really good point, Brett, and one that leads us to our final segment, which is about adaptability, I suppose, within organizations. So what you're talking about there, and a little tip that I have as well for listeners is 2 things. One is we hire for behavior, and so behavior will always win, no matter what you do in terms of, you can have personality tests, as you say, Brett, and you can do all that. The other one is grow within strategies. Taking young people in and actually developing them up and growing within is always been a mantra of what I've done with my companies over the years, and that's been very successful. And I think that we need that more than ever now with the advent of AI, which is totally dynamic for everybody around the outside. So look, I think what we'll do is we'll dive into the final segment, and we're going to explore a couple of models now and a couple of frameworks, and we're going to paint the picture, Brett, through some of your experience and the frameworks that you use out there when you do experimentation and, basically what works, practical tests and all of those sort of things. Before we dive into the questions, there's been a couple of good models that, that you've been looking at, like Amara's law from, I think it was Stanford from many years ago, and the Jevons Paradox and things like that, about humans in society generally, right at the top, big picture stuff. If you can just explain why 2023 sort of felt like the hype and everything that sort of happened with AI, and 2026 may feel like consequence now, and the rubber's hitting the road, we call it, especially with Amara's law, and also the efficiency gains that come out of this through consumption. Just talk us through the practical realities of a couple of those little models. Well, they're not little, but these models that you see.
Yeah, look, I think models like that, and anybody who's worked with a Big Four consulting group or a Boston consulting group or something has come across sort of models. What they allow us to do is kind of try a way of thinking against a particular problem to see if it fits the model. And all it does is give you sort of a ready reckoner to kind of go, does this vaguely fit? So Amara's law is basically this premise that effectively humans all have the same brain and we have these behaviors. And so behavioral psychologists are great at picking this stuff up. And Roy Amara, who was this futurist in the States, recognized that whenever we introduce a piece of technology, humans see it as the disruptive force that it has the potential to be, and we dramatically overestimate the short-term impact of it. And then what happens is the short-term impact doesn't completely upend the world, and we decide that it was all hype and that nothing's going to come of it. And then what happens is in the medium to long term, it actually really does change the world. And, there's countless instances of this where, ChatGPT's been out for knocking on the door of 4 years, and for 3.9 years, we've been hearing that it's the end of the world as we know it. It's existential crisis, so there'll be no such thing as jobs. And what we've done is we've been lulled into this sort of weird false sense of security that what's happening is the disruption is happening incrementally. It's happening really quickly, but it's happening in isolated pockets. And people make this mistake that they think that large language models that you can talk to is AI. And AI is a wild and vast landscape. And this is a very small niche area that matured very much quicker than the rest of it will. And so, world models and artificial general intelligence, all these other things, there's a good chance that a lot of those things, I'll be dead and buried before a lot of them see the light of day. But I was speaking at a conference in Singapore in 2017, AI Asia Big Data Conference, and McKinsey were there presenting. But they got up, and stuck with me ever since. They got up and said, so that's 2017, they got up and said that their modeling determined that 12 years from now, Western markets, the majority of taxi journeys will be undertaken by autonomous vehicles. And I came home, and I had small children at the time, and I came home from Singapore, having spoken at this event, and I said to my wife, our kids won't learn to drive. Well, guess what? I've been teaching them to drive, and it's a hard slog. But what's really interesting is if you look at where we are, we're 9 years on from that. It'll be 9 years next month that I was at that conference in Singapore. And autonomous vehicle are a thing in some markets in the world. And so now you kind of go, well, if they're a thing in Austin, Texas, and they're a thing in San Francisco, there's a fairly solid chance that they'll be a thing in Wollongong in 3 years' time. And so this sort of thing where we discount the level of change, it's really dangerous because then the change sneaks up on us. So what we have to do is kind of temper our expectations about how rapidly things are going to change, but we also have to be a participant in the change so that when it does completely change things, we're the people who are kind of ready to go with that sort of stuff. So I think that's a really useful model. Gartner have built a hype cycle on it, and it's basically a branded version of Amara's law. They just plot everything on the one chart. But it really does help us sort of understand which things are hype and which things are actually being invested in and are having a commercial outcome. And so, the landscape is changing. Some things are going to change more quickly than others. There's definitely going to be change, but nothing's going to change in the next 90 days. So, I think that's a really useful kind of perspective on that. Lou, the other thing we were talking about was that Jevons Paradox, which is effectively, it's this idea that as innovations come to market, the cost of delivery of the outcome drops. And what happens is because the cost drops, the number of use cases explodes exponentially. And all of a sudden we kind of go, that thing I thought we were never going to have again is now everywhere. And I don't understand how wrong I got it. And the classic example is people sort of say that, automatic teller machines came in and my father was a bank manager for 53 years. And, they thought that that'd be the end of the bank teller. And what happened was bank tellers got repackaged and they became home insurance salespeople behind a desk. We just reimagine them and we redesign it to accommodate what the technology is. But these are the sorts of things that if you understand that model and you understand behavioral psychology and how humans change and how organizations adjust, you can start to kind of go, how do I design a version of this company that is going to be really, really relevant in the next 3 years? And anybody who can tell you that they're designing their organization for 7 years from now is lying, because we don't know. But if you come up with a really good version 3 years from now and are constantly redesigning for 2 or 3 years from now, 7 years from now, you'll be in good shape.
And before we kind of started this podcast, we were having a conversation about this concept of exploring and exploiting, and not a lot of organizations do that particularly, do both of them particularly well. What does a business that does both actually look like from the inside, and what are the traits of that organization and its people?
I think organizations find it really easy to get creative about new product development or innovation or those kind of things when times are good, because the board or the institutional investors or the owner is not applying pressure to tighten the belt. In reality, the time we need to be innovative is actually when times are tough. We need to look at everything we do and go, is there a better way? How do I reinvent this? And the challenge I see in businesses that don't survive is the ones that are not prepared to reinvent when times are tough. And so having a culture and an understanding and a framework and some guardrails and some guidelines. Experiments can look like this. They can cost this much money. They can take this long. Those kind of things. I worked in an organization once where I had a good relationship with the CEO, and he said to me, "You can do as many $20,000 experiments as you want in a year," because he knew that I couldn't do enough to bankrupt the organization. We had $200 million a year in revenue. But what he knew was that if I failed on 6 $20,000 initiatives and one of them went half okay and one of them was cracking, that cracking one might make a $20 million difference to revenue next year. And so that was, I had a backing of that guy, and he had a strong relationship with the board, and I had board visibility, and we could do some interesting things in that space. But there are a lot of organizations, particularly in tough times, who go, nobody touch anything, because this is really fragile right now. It is, and that's the time to see if we can break it and put it back together in a better way.
Yeah, it's that conversation about risk and risk being the manifestation of an organization's fear, but us not always remembering that risks can be managed and mitigated and transferred and accepted and all of those things that just has this paralyzing effect. Sorry, Lou, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's exactly the same. When we have these black swan events, and there was one with COVID, and hopefully we're not coming into another. But basically, I think that's the time to double down on these innovation and adaptability cycles, right? And these are the times to put more money behind marketing and money behind, operational efficiency gains with these tools now that we have in hand. So I'm expecting the innovators, the early adopters, but also the really big thinkers, that example of that organization with the 20 grand projects that you did, they're going to be the ones that succeed if times get a little bit tougher across the global economy.
The key thing there, Lou, is that's 100% right, but you can't wait until the tough times to design your innovation culture. If you have an innovation culture, when tough times come, you can be like, guys, we need to pull that innovation culture out and put our foot on the gas. If times are tough and revenue's tight and you've just lost, 20% of your customers because of a market downturn, sitting down in a room with a whiteboard going, how do we innovate around here? where are our innovation muscles? You haven't got them. And so
in Australia, that is happening in the construction industry right now. I think, like, I don't think there are very, very few organizations in construction who are looking at the kind of 6-month project pipeline and going, we really need to get our innovation in order. It's just not happening. It doesn't seem. Like, how is that going to happen? How are they going to get their head into the game?
I've got a presentation for a client in Sydney in a couple of weeks' time, and it's to a sales program in a horizontally integrated business that has sort of capital and legal and all sorts of other bits and pieces involved in it. And in the briefing calls with those people, what we're talking about is you don't need to tell your salespeople to sharpen their tools when they're shooting fish in a barrel. You need to make sure their tools are sharp, so that one day when there's no fish left in the barrel, we can go and find more barrels. And when you discover that there's no fish in your barrel, isn't the time to look at your skills. So you got to kind of, have those muscles, keep the innovation toolkit sharp, redesign our teams and our function and our value proposition, keep those toolkits sharp, because, you can spend a lot of time exploiting. We talk about explore versus exploit. You can spend a lot of time exploiting, but if at the point in the future you have to explore, you better be ready to explore and understand what's our board's appetite, what's our capital allocation, what's our guidelines, what's our framework, what's our governance, what's our data sovereignty. If we know that stuff, we can flip extra resources that we have from exploiting into explore if there's a market downturn and we have extra resources. But we got to be cognizant that we have to be ready to do that.
Hope isn't exactly a strategy, is it?
No.
I feel like there's so much that we could unpack, but we have to kind of draw this to a close, and we have a way that we would like to try. So we're exploring right now, but let's try and get the rapid fire 0-shot fast 5 across. Brett Wiskar. Lou, do you want to take away the first question? And the rules of engagement are fast, punchy answers, just the things that intuitively come to mind for you, and we'll kind of knock through them one after the other. Are you ready?
Yeah, bring it on.
Let's do it. Yeah, so rapid fire. First question for you, Brett, and for the listeners. What's the one thing you'd tell a business owner who is just getting started with AI right now?
I think they have to approach AI like a unique problem-solving toolkit and find unique problems to solve with it. It's the only way they'll learn where it creates the most value. If they try to solve problems they already have solutions for, they're not building their problem-solving skills.
What AI tool do you use every day, Brett?
I have this weird relationship with AI agents, regardless of whether it's Claude or Copilot or Chat. I will build an agent at the drop of a hat. I'll be at my coffee machine at home, working from home, making coffee, and I'll go, I've got that thing I need to do this afternoon. I'm going to go and design and build an agent to do it with me in real time. And the agent might have a lifespan of 90 minutes, or it might be then redesigned to be something that works for me over time. So I probably have 15 agents that I'm working with at any given point in time, and I haven't necessarily got an orchestration agent to have them play nicely together at this point in time. But I'm a big fan of kind of my agent building muscles are really strong because I build them all the time and give them new context and new frameworks and new instructions. And that, I think, serves me really well when I come up against unique problems that I don't know how to solve.
Question 3, what is one prediction you have about AI that hasn't happened yet, Brett, but you actually believe it will?
Lou, I think the prediction is not so much what hasn't happened yet that I think will. I actually think it's what won't. I don't see the demise of the workforce or jobs or capitalism or complete upending of industries. I think if you're a conduit business, if you're an intermediary in an industry or in a business, you might be in a spot of bother, but I don't think the sky's falling. I don't think wholesale disruption is going to happen overnight. You guys spoke recently about robotics and AI in other areas. And I think this idea that large language models and the agent workforce behind them is an economic cliff that we're charging towards. I just don't see that. Now, I could be wrong, but the other thing that might change that is if artificial general intelligence turns up faster than they anticipate. But I think that there's, it's a great quote that the people who think that AI is going to take all of the work mistakenly think that all the work we do is all the work there is. There's an insane amount of work that humans can't get to yet. They can't even conceive of. And so the more we can get the AI to do the stuff we're doing now, the better chance we can go and find that stuff.
Number 4, Brett, where do you consume your AI knowledge? Podcasts or books or videos, or tell me.
Look, 0-shot is obviously at the top of the pile, but
obviously,
of course.
Yep, flattery gets you everywhere.
Read a massive amount of articles and have innovation forums and sites and places that I go. A lot of it is kind of snippeted stuff. I have got a little agent that will go out each day and scan the world for not just AI, but innovation and methodologies and other things, and curate a feed. And then I critique it. It says, here's the 10 things you need to know today. And I go, actually, I didn't need to know that. And here's why. And I give it more information so that tomorrow it brings me a slightly better list. But yeah, podcasts and some key web platforms and a voracious curiosity.
Awesome. I love that word. Curiosity is very important. Final question. Speaking of curiosity, who do you think we should bring to the pod as the next guest?
Look, I don't know how powerful your ability to pull people out of their corporate frameworks and have them say things that their employers might not like them to say. But two names sprang to mind. There's a guy at the University of Sydney called Danny Liu, and Danny's brain is beyond compare. And so he's developed working with Microsoft and some vendors, developed a product called Cogniti, which is a cloud-based agent platform for educators, which is available to other Australian universities. And anytime I'm on a call with Danny, I wonder what's wrong with my brain, because seeing his in action is a wild ride. Yeah, the other guy is Evan Shelshier, and Evan works for Boston Consulting Group based in Brisbane. But Evan's, when it comes to industrial mathematics or, computer processing capacity and its impact on economies and industries and organizations, those two people are genuine thought leaders and have very different kind of perspectives on this kind of technology compared to, those of us that work in the sectors that I work in and the client base that I work in, or I know Lou and James, you both kind of have different positions in the market and different sort of organizations you work with. These guys have a global perspective on some of the big problems that this technology can solve. And then ultimately that is how it trickles down into the industries that we play with. Phenomenal.
Awesome. Hot tips. Thank you. Well, my key takeaway today has been, James, stop hiring for the job. That's been the main thing, and start hiring for redesign, and really good tips from Brett about who the right candidates are. James, what was your takeaway out of Brett's conversation today?
The main one for me is the gap between, and we know this well in technology because it's how we tend to break down the work that we do. It's the gap between what and why, like what we want to do and why we want to do it, and actually the how of getting in and getting it done. And the hype cycle ultimately being the long form manifestation of that. Like all the what and why people are like, this is going to be great. And then we get into the mire of actual implementation, and then we kind of lose friends along the way.
Yeah.
Invariably, we come out the other side with some pretty amazing things and fundamentally having shaped things in a different way. So that's my key takeaway today.
That's awesome. And look, a big thank you to Brett Wiskar, who's come on today as the first guest and created some amazing insights that I'm sure are going to make a lot of great social media reels that Yenny is going to cut up and feature out there, because there's been a lot of good radio voice level sound bites from Brett, with that deep voice that he has. So Brett, thank you very much.
Thanks, James.
Thanks for coming on. And
I appreciate the opportunity. Really I love the pod. I listen to it every time you guys put it out, and I'm delighted when I wake up each time there's a new episode. Delighted to be here. Very honoured to be the first guest, and hopefully at some point, 10 or 15 guests down the track, we can do this again and talk about how things have changed since today.
Sounds awesome. Yeah. Look, thanks again to Brett. And next episode, we're heading back. We are going to talk about a related topic that I think was highlighted really well by Brett's conversation today, is the human factors around AI and the value of managing that change effectively. The more AI we have, the more human we seem to need to be. So we'll see you then. But Lou, do you want to sign us out?
Yeah, thanks, mate. And yeah, thanks to Brett, of course, but thanks for joining James and I on Zero Shot. We do this for the builders and the skeptics and the strategists who are actually moving the needle. So whether you're a CEO in Melbourne or an operator in Manchester, your perspective is what keeps us and keeps this show anti-hype and clarity first. So you'll find us on LinkedIn, zeroshot.com.au. You'll find us on YouTube, and you'll find us on TikTok as well. We've gone past 900 for some of our views, so keep those views up. James, we're going to thank the sponsor.
And thanks to Prompt Cowboy for supporting the show, helping us have people like Brett on, and for helping businesses harness AI without the guesswork. So mosey on down to promptcowboy.ai, stay sharp, stay sovereign, and we'll see you all in the next episode. Thanks again, Brett. Thanks, Lou. Have a great day, guys.
Cheers.